Welcome, low ego action heroes. I'm Debbie Levitt from Delta CX. We are a full service CX and UX consultancy. And this is my Axure 10 Core Skills course. I've been using Axure since February 2011, and I've been teaching it for many, many years. And in fact, I've been one of Axure's recommended trainers since 2014. This course is designed to take you from super Axure newbie or Axure afraid all the way through to confident intermediate. So if you've landed on this one video, there are many, many others. Please check our Axure lessons playlist for a lot more videos about using Axure. The Delta CX YouTube channel has over 500 videos on it as of when I'm recording this in December 2021, and I hope you'll subscribe and join in some of our live streams. I'm live usually 3 or 4 times a week with teaching UX research and design, talking about CX, helping people get into the profession, helping leaders and managers, and of course, don't forget Tuesday, office hours, Ask Me Anything. So subscribe and hang out here. So thanks for being here. Please subscribe and let's jump into that next Axure lesson.
Let's do a couple of ways to look at something called a listener. A listener is like an automatically running background process. And we're coming back to our checkboxes because I had hinted much earlier in this course that I was going to show you a neat way to deal with these checkboxes later. A listener is an automatically running process. Basically, you set it up so that every fraction of a second, you ask Axure to check for certain conditions or do a certain thing. And we're going to do that here with our checkboxes. So if we do a preview, we can remember what the earlier checkbox lesson looked like, because now it feels so long ago, doesn't it? Ah, the good old days. Okay, so in this one, we did a check all, and, well, this was the broken one, if you remember. We did a check all, and then we said if you uncheck apples, it'll uncheck check all, and then we said, but wait, if I check all 4, shouldn't check all be checked? And I said, you know, there's a much easier way to do this. I'll tell you later. Well, that time is now. So let's imagine that we want Axure every fraction of a second to check behind the scenes if all 4 of these are checked. And once that condition is checked, once that condition is met, do something. So let's take a look at how we would build this. Now, a listener is a dynamic panel, and the dynamic panel can be anywhere on your page, and it doesn't have to be big. I usually make mine small enough that I could see it, but not so big that it's going to be in the way of anything. I sometimes put it near what I'm doing, like this, but of course I might send it to the back so people don't accidentally click on it, because remember, Axure is very serious about their layering. I will call it the listener panel so that if I really can't find it, I'll be able to easily spot it from the outline, either from eyeballing or searching. And I'll send it to back. And one of the qualities that our listener panel must have is that it must have 2 states. So I'm going to click duplicate. Now you've probably noticed, you're like, what is she doing? That's an empty panel with 2 states with no content. What is this? And the reason why the listener panel works is because we're going to create a cool domino effect. So I know that some of this early setup looks nonsensical, but just to know that we are setting up a domino effect. The next part of setting up a domino effect is coming over to our page interactions and creating one. If you already have page interactions, you're going to be adding to them. This is an on-page load interaction. Some people do the on-load for the listener panel itself. No points taken off there, totally up to you. I mentioned earlier that anything that seems to happen because the page has loaded, I tend to do at the page loaded level so that all of my interactions are easy to find. If we start doing the whole listener thing on the listener panel and you didn't give it a good name and people can't find it on the page because it's just an empty dynamic panel that you might have made tiny, someone's going to be frustrated. So remember to take care of your future self and your coworkers developers who might deal with your file later and make sure this is all easy to find. So the listener gets started because remember, this is an automatically running background process, and we get it started by saying set panel state of the listener panel, next, wrap, and then the repeat is how often do you want the listener to try to run the cases or case that you're going to write here. And we'll start with 1,000 milliseconds because it actually feels a little bit slow. It's a full second, and then I'll show you how we come back in and make this a smaller amount of time if we want to make something happen faster. So for now, let's do that, but we don't need any animations or special behavior. It's an empty panel. Nobody can see it. We just want Axure every 1,000 milliseconds to go state 1, state 2, state 1, state 2, state 1, state 2, state 1, state 2. And again, you might be like, why, Deb? This sounds stupid, but stick with me. It's going to make sense. Okay, so now we've got that. If you wanted to baby step test that, you technically could. You could refresh, and you could load up, our buddy the console, and you could run the trace. And let's refresh. So we could see here in the console that it seems to be working, but of course there's nothing for us to see. So we just have to trust that this is running. But once we build more of this, we will be able to see that this is working. So let's go back to the listener panel itself. Again, if you can't find it on your page, good thing you named it, find it from the outline. And now we're going to build our case or cases. In this case, we'll start with 1. And the idea here is, hey, Axure, I want you to check if all 4 of these are checked every fraction of a second or 1,000 milliseconds. And if all 4 of these are checked, then I want you to check the check all checkbox. And let's give this a name quickly. Oh, there we go. Oh, I'm just slow clicking on it to get to the text because we have a layering adventure here. Oops, I'm in dots land. Thanks a lot, Axure. There we go. Check all checkbox. Let's give it a name. Really check all checkbox. Okay, now we'll be able to find it because we have other check all checkboxes on the page. So back on the panel, let's build the interaction that says if all 4 checkboxes are checked, check the check all checkbox. But we have to figure out what is the event. What triggers this? Now, what did we just set up? We set up a dynamic panel, and we set it up so that every second or fraction of a second, it's going to change from state 1 to state 2, or from state 2 back to state 1. That means we can create a good domino effect by choosing panel state changed. Hey, Axure, every time this panel changes its state from 1 to 2 or 2 back to 1, can you try to do something for me? And that is how we create this automatically running process that happens kind of behind the scenes. So every time that panel state changes, we will tell Axure, we're looking to check the really check all checkbox to selected true, but only under a certain condition. So we'll call it if all checked, just to remind myself what I'm doing. And now I have to write these out in slow motion. So if apples, now let's check if I have the right apples checkbox, because remember we copied and pasted these and we want to make sure I'm getting the right one. This one's called apples checkbox and this one has no name. Okay, so great, that's the one I'm picking. Again, best for you to go back and name everything to make sure that the ones you're choosing are correct. So let's go back to my condition and finish writing it. If selected of apples is true, if selected of, so again, we are checking if all of those fruits are truly selected. So let's get all 4 fruits in here. If selected of strawberries is true and is selected of, sorry, Axure, don't be so grumpy. Bananas is true. Now, this is a good time to take a look at our match any and match all, because if we said match any, then if any one of these were true, Axure would fire the case and you would see the check all checkbox checked, even if only one of these were checked. This is where we definitely want match all. We want our Boolean and. So if apples is truly checked, and kiwis is truly checked, and strawberries is truly checked, and bananas is truly checked. All right, so we should be able to test this out and see if it's working. Refresh. And we can even open up our console and watch the action happen if we'd like. Now, do you see how my console's going a little bit wild? And I keep getting panel state changed, panel state changed. I'm getting it once a second because Axure says, hey, you have this thing that is automatically running in the background, and every once a second, because that was the timing we put on it, I am trying to see if I can run any of the cases that you've written because the panel state changed. Because the panel state is changing. Every second it's changing. So I can check off strawberries. Axure says, nope, not yet. Didn't meet the condition, so I didn't do a thing. Kiwis is checked. Nope, not yet. Bananas is checked. Nope, not yet. And apples is checked. And Axure says, oh, look, I did a thing. I found that all of them were checked, so I checked the check all checkbox to true. So notice this one got a check. And we could do it again. We can uncheck apples, which unchecks check all. And Axure says, yep, I'm waiting once a second to see if we can do this. Now this time, watch the check all checkbox and watch how fast it gets checked compared to when I check off apples. So let's check off apples. And then the check all checkbox checked about a second later. That was realistic in that the check all checkbox got checked, but it felt a little non-realistic in how slow it seemed to work. Now it's up to you whether you just want to write a note to your developers and say, hey, this should happen pretty much instantaneously, or if you want to mess with the timing of things and tell Axure to check more often. If you want to do the check more often version, then you are going back to page loaded. So remember, where am I now? I have clicked away from everything. I'm at the page level. I'm going into page loaded. I'm going into our listener panel, setting the state, and I'm changing the timing. Just to go wild, let's say 250 milliseconds. Now Axure is going to check 4 times a second if this thing is ready to go. So you're going to see lots. See how fast this is going? There we go. It's 4 times a second. So I'll go strawberries, kiwis, bananas. Now, as I check apples, watch the check all checkbox and see how fast it happens. That was much faster, a little bit more realistic, totally up to you. Now the question I normally get here is, uh-oh, Debbie, we're asking Axure to keep doing something behind the scenes. Is that going to slow our Axure file down? It shouldn't. I've got some files with super wild stuff built into that listener, and I have not seen a performance problem with that. So just know that it still tends to be repeaters and large images that will slow Axure files down. A listener should not. Of course, if your listener ties into something in repeaters, then it possibly could, but it wouldn't be the listener itself. So, in fact, when we do repeaters in the advanced course, you'll see how I have such a large repeater. It can be a little bit slow sometimes, but Axure is always improving their performance, and so it's been getting better since I first built that repeater in like 2017 at a job I was at, and that's the repeater I used to teach for one of my repeater lessons. So the listener can be used for a lot of sneaky, interesting stuff. Let's do another listener example from scratch. I'm going to create a page and I'm going to call it, listener, oh, good morning, listener 2. I hope I spelled that right. And let's just quickly build a cheesy little form. So let's imagine we have a text field, and let's imagine we have a checkbox, And let's imagine we have a submit button. So let's grab a button. Now, of course, you could pretend you have a much larger form, but let's imagine that this button is disabled by default, which means we want to also assign it a style effect for our disabled button. And if you can't find it, let's search for it. Oh, Axure is not friendly with these searches here. Let's see, primary button disabled. Here we go. All right, so this will be the enabled version. Gray will be the disabled version. Yes, the styles don't match, but that's not important to learn this part of the lesson. So let's imagine that this button is not enabled until they have filled out all of the required fields and checked this box. So let's imagine that there's multiple fields that need to be filled out, and there's this checkbox, and then this field can be enabled. So let's name this one. Let's pretend it's a name field. And let's imagine it's required, and we've made that clear with the field label. And let's call this, I'm just going to call it checkbox. I'm a little lazy this morning. And we are going to, we've got our button. And now let's name the button as well, submit button, because when things are happening in the listener, they're not happening because people clicked the button or people clicked the checkbox. So it's going to be important to name lots of stuff so that we can refer to the right things in our listener. So let's imagine that we make a usual Deb listener panel, 20 by 20. That's usually, sometimes I make them a little bit bigger. Let's name it listener panel so we can easily find it later. Let's give it 2 blank states. So state 1. That's probably your most common newbie mistake, is you forget to make that second state, and so the panel state never changes, and then your listener doesn't work. So we've got our 2 states, and now we're going to kick off the listener with our page loaded and set panel state of the listener panel to next with the wrap, with the repeat. And just to mix it up a little bit, I'll do, let's do a different number this time, half a second. All right, so we've got that in place. Now we have to teach Axure, when do we want this button to be enabled? Well, I only want this button to be enabled if all of these things have been filled, let's imagine, filled out. So on the listener panel, we're going to write an on panel state changed. Because again, the panel state is changing because of the listener, and every time that panel state changes, in this case every half a second, I want to see if the condition is met for Axure to do the thing. Now the thing is easy. Enable the submit button. Enable. The action is easy. It's the condition that's complicated. So let's take a look at our conditions. If everything filled out, or if we could also say maybe it's if the required fields are filled out. So you could do this just with your required fields. So hey Axure, take a look at the text on the widget name field. Is it not equal to blankness? Who remembers the other way to do this? Hands up. Okay, some of you got it. It was length. So if the length on a widget, length of widget, name field does not equal 0, that would mean it's got characters in it. If the text on the widget does not equal blankness, and if is selected, not of this, because this is the listener panel, of the checkbox equals true, then let's enable this button. So again, take a look at this. This is if text on widget is not blankness, which means they filled it out or at least put something in that box. And if the checkbox is selected, then I want you to enable the submit button. And let's give ourselves a fresh preview and take a look at this. Behind the scenes, this should be running. We can check our trace. There it goes. Every half a second, it's trying to do a thing. I checked the box, still didn't meet the condition because both have to be true. But as soon as I type one letter into this, it should work. There we go. So as soon as I had something in there, which was either length was not 0 or text on widget wasn't blankness. Axure says, aha, both of these conditions have been met. I'll enable this button. But if I'm a cheeky person and I erase this or I uncheck this, we would want that button to be disabled, right? Because they didn't do all the things. That means we need to write another case. Hey, Axure, I've got something else that could happen here. If not all required fields filled out. That's getting a little long, but you know, if it helps your future self or your teammates, go for it. Now, here, I could just kind of X this out. We can just use this as an or else. This is one of those places where, hey, either everything I just said is true or it's not. There isn't kind of a gray area here. There aren't 10 possible outcomes here. So we could say or else, and technically have no condition because the conditions would be varied. In that case, disable the button, submit button, make sure you check disable. So again, if you don't specify a condition, Axure treats this as or else. So either I'm going to do this if this condition is met. If this condition is not met, I'm just going to do this. There isn't even a condition to check. I'm either going to do this or I'm going to do this. Make sure yours is disabled on the second one. So now that means if the first condition isn't met, the second one is automatically met because it's an or else. And you can see, in fact, Axure's already running it. Axure says, I'm running your not all fields filled out case because these aren't filled out. And when I check one, Axure says, I'm still running your not all fields filled out case because they're not both filled out. Once I do this, Axure says, oh, I am now doing your required fields are filled out case because that condition got met. But if I'm sneaky and I say, no, I don't agree to the terms, then Axure says, oop, now I'm running your not all fields filled out case and I've disabled the button. So again, enable or disable on a checkbox, as we learned earlier, is just fine. That would absolutely work. But if your button only gets enabled when all the required fields are filled out, which can be a good idea because it can save people from making a mistake and accidentally submitting the form and then having to get a bunch of error messages. Maybe the button isn't enabled until they fill out all the required fields. Though again, sometimes the error messages help people see what they haven't done, so you have to decide which one works better for what you're building and your target users and their context. But either letting them try to submit it and giving them errors to draw their attention to what to fix, or not enabling the button until they've done all the things, which sometimes forces some people to have to look for what they haven't done. But again, that may be a little bit tough for screen readers. So even if you don't use the technique I just showed you, it's another good example of a listener. It's an example of where we want Axure to check for something behind the scenes over and over, basically never stopping, and running cases for us because all of a sudden conditions were met, or I guess all of a sudden conditions were met. End of sentence. So that's the lesson on listeners. See you in the next video.